Hi, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. So today's lecture is our first kind of in a series that moves more into the area of international political economy. So far, we've spent more time looking at international security, so different forms of conflict. Um, Now we're going to be looking for a few classes at uh, things like trade, international finance, international economic development, and stuff like that. So the first one today is on international trade. Um, so kind of to begin, just like in security, we had certain theories that we could use to help explain uh, kind of different forms of conflict or whatever we want to be explaining in terms of security. We also have certain theoretical approaches that we can use in international political economy. Some of them will actually be quite similar to some of the security theories. You'll definitely see how they're can be related. So three that we're going to talk about today are economic liberalism, mercantilism, and critical approaches. So economic liberalism is an approach to international political economy, or IPE, that emphasizes the gains made through trade and that in practice is committed to free trade, free capital flows, and an open world economy, right? So economic liberalism kind of comes from the basis that trade and an open world economy can actually help make things better. So it looks at it looks at the gains that do come from trade, from free capital flow, so the free flow of money in an open world economy. Um, so it's an economic variant of liberalism. So we talked kind of earlier about it with regards kind of to kind of commercial liberalism. So it looks at the possibilities of joint gains through cooperation. So if different states are willing to cooperate and integrate their economies, they can actually both do better, right? So they can experience joint gains. So in the argument B, say if you have free trade between a couple of countries, both of them will do better. So the overall pie, if we think of an economy as a pie, the overall pie will get larger. So everyone will get more just by virtue of splitting up a larger pie. States are important actors in IR from the perspective of economic liberalism, but they're not the only important actors. So that's similar to liberalism, where different, corporations or non-governmental organizations or individuals or whatnot can play a role in how economics or how the world system plays out. That's not to say that states stop being important, just that they're not the only actors that we need to be paying attention to. Economic liberals argue that in practice, great gains have been realized from free trade. Even though both parties gain in exchange, they may not gain equally among all participating states. Economic liberals are interested in maximizing the overall joint benefits from exchange, and that if you have a situation where everyone's kind of the joint gains are the highest, we would refer to that as a Pareto optimal situation. They have little to say about how total benefits are distributed among parties, right? So um, whenever you have kind of trade between different states or any different system for trade, some states are going to gain potentially more than others. So if you increase the size of the pie, maybe that one state gets almost all the gains and another state gets none of them, or maybe that the gains are split evenly. Economic liberals have less to say about the distribution among parties. That's something often more that realists focus on, that you need to still, even when you're talking about joint gains, you still need to look at who's getting what. That's not something that economic liberals talk as much about. More what they're focused on are the joint gains. States as participants in the international economy try to realize the greatest overall gains for all states while simultaneously bargaining to maximize their own share of those gains, right? So states, yes, they want to do the best for themselves, but they also, are looking at growing the global economy as much as possible. And often because that's from the perception that gains from others from a purely economic liberal perspective can actually be gains for yourself, right? If, for example, say you're Canada and you want to be exporting different material, the stronger the other economies are, the more they're able to buy Canadian products, right? So that's actually good if others gain from a Canadian perspective. It also means that they may be producing, other really good products the more that the other states grow, and From the perspective of a Canadian consumer, being able to buy better products is also good. So we want to say, again, sticking with the Canadian perspective, we want the Canadian economy to grow as much as possible from economic exchange, but it doesn't necessarily also mean that we want others to fail. It's actually often in our best interest, from at least this perspective, for others to receive the largest gains possible. Individuals and firms are the main actors in the economy. While again, states play a role, it's looking a lot at the transactions between firms and individuals within them. The government should interfere as little as possible, and it should do so to solve market inefficiencies. So we talked earlier about time when we talked about neoliberal institutionalism, we talked about how international organizations can solve problems in the market, and within states, it's the government that does that. Well, that's the same thing from an economic liberal perspective. The government should let the free economy, solve itself for the most part. Just the invisible hand will distribute resources as well as possible. But the government should only then intervene when there's market inefficiency. So if for some reason the market's not operating properly, for some reason, could be corruption or any other, or lack of information that could be causing problems, then the government should intervene and to provide public goods, because public goods will be underprovided by the private sector. Things like infrastructure of roads and stuff like that help everyone out. Unless we're toll roads, there's very little profit from it. The private sector is going to underprovide those things. So you need the government to provide things like infrastructure, defense, and whatnot. So that's the role of the government. But other than that, it should allow business and individuals to operate in an open world economy. So that's economic liberalism. Mercantilism. So you don't see as much mercantilism anymore, but it was really big, in centuries past. And you see some elements of it sometimes in some government positions. You've seen a little bit of kind of mercantilism type approaches maybe coming back lately in more nationalistic type policies. But there'll be some differences from the mercantilism we're presenting here. So economics should show up politics. The creation of wealth underlies state power, right? So economics is less important kind of in its own right. It's more important in terms of how it solves or serves broader politics and how it serves state power. Because power is relative, trade is desirable only when the distribution of benefits favors one's own state over rivals, right? So that fits a lot with kind of the realist type logic, that, while, free trade may increase gains, and that's great and all, but what we have to really worry about is not just, are we getting joint gains, but who's gaining more? Because if the other side is gaining more than us, and they can use that power, they can use those additional gains to become stronger and pose a greater security threat. The terms of exchange shape the relative rates at which states accumulate power, and thus shape the way power distributions in the international system change over time, right? So the way that economic flows and different resources that are important, they change differently. And so if you want to see the distribution of power, look at kind of the underlying economic factors that can be translated into power. So how can you buy power? What's the kind of important means of economic exchange, and whoever controls those will be more powerful. So really, economics is of secondary importance. Yes, obviously, economics still matters for the well-being of people, but from a political perspective and from a mercantilist perspective, its primary goal is to be able to increase power. So you can use the wealth that you've accumulated through trade to translate that into weapons and military power. So mercantilism achieved prominence several hundred years ago, and Britain used trade to rise in relative power in the international system around the 18th century. At that time, mercantilism meant specifically the creation of a trade surplus in order to stockpile money in the form of precious metals, gold and silver at the time, which could then be used to buy military capabilities in time of war. So mercantilism doesn't necessarily have to always mean a trade surplus, because stockpiling precious metals wasn't necessarily, as important today, although we still do stockpile gold. But that was the form it took then. But the important idea is that you're able to use kind of your economic strength and to be able to use it to buy the military capabilities that you're going to need in time of war. So that's the importance of economics, is to give you the wealth that you need to be able to protect yourself, and to give you greater wealth than others, so that you don't want to be losing economically, because any losses in economics, if others are able to, say, store up more wealth, and then they can translate that into greater amounts of power. And then finally, critical approaches. So focus on social groups that are affected by the distribution of wealth that results from trade, right? So this one's looking at how does trade, or any system of trade, affect different groups of people within society. So other theories focus on inequalities in distribution of wealth between states, right? So they might look at, who gains what amount. So mercantilism, liberalism is looking at increases in joint gains, and mercantilism is looking at who gains more than others. Critical theories look at inequalities between states too, but also at the impact of the distribution of wealth and people. So it also looks within states. And when it's looking at even inequalities between states, it's less to see who's gaining the most. It's more to see who's gaining the least, right? Who's getting left behind, what factors are leading different states to get left behind, and what are the impacts? And within all states, from the richest to the poorest, what's the impact of trade on distribution of wealth on people, right? Even some of the richest states, some people that gain immensely from international trade, the distribution of gains within the state from free trade isn't evenly distributed, right? Some of the people are going to gain a lot from free trade, where some people are going to lose. And that's always something with free trade is, well, even if you gain in aggregate, that doesn't mean that everybody's gaining. So critical scholars are more inclined to ask whether opening up trade and increasing efficiencies results in massive unemployment among some groups of workers, or shift to lower paid, de-skilled forms of work, right? So does it lead to some people just, losing their job because their sector of the economy is no longer needed? And does it push towards lower paid, de-skilled forms of work? All right, so when we're talking about international trade, or just international political economy, particularly lately, we've been talking, or the last couple of decades, we've been talking a lot about the rise of globalization. As we see the spread of trade and everything else, globalization certainly become one of the buzzwords. And so globalization could be defined as the increasing integration of the world in terms of communication, culture, and economics. May also refer to the changing subjective experience of space and time that accompanies this process, right? So it's looking at how the world has become, smaller or more interconnected in terms of certainly economics, so increase of trade and spread of finance globally, right? You're not just doing trade or sending money to people, locally, you're doing it nationally and internationally. Culture, right? We have access to cultural products, not just from our own country, but from so many other countries. And communication. You can now have Skype or FaceTime with people all over the world. It used to, if you wanted to, communicate with somebody from across the world, you needed a pen pal and you sent them a letter, and it took, ages to get a response, because the letter had to be sent across oceans, and it was really, really slow, and the person then had to write back and put it back in the mail, and then you get your response. I mean, now you can WhatsApp or Skype or FaceTime with people all across the world, and it's as if they were right beside you. In the time of lockdown with coronavirus, it's just as easy to talk to somebody across the world as it is to talk to somebody in your own city almost. Another definition is the widening, deepening, and speeding up of worldwide interconnectedness in all aspects of contemporary social life. So it's wider, deeper, and faster. So we have deeper connections over a widening, so a broader amount of different subject areas, and speeding up of worldwide. So everything's going faster. Again, like communication, it used to take weeks, if not months, to get responses. Uh, Now it's a matter of seconds or milliseconds that you can get a response. Um, so it's just gone into travel, right? Like it used to be, if you wanted to travel to Europe, you had to take a boat across, and that was really slow. Then air travel increasingly came in, but that was, not something that everyone had access to. Now, more and more people around the world have access to international travel. You can travel to Europe and see, uh, you know, whatever country interests you, and then come home, and that's a viable summer vacation for a lot of people, where that wasn't the case in the past, or it would certainly take a lot more than a summer. So that's kind of the process of globalization that we've seen, come. Uh, we've seen definitely take hold over the last decades, and definitely get deeper, faster, and wider. The integration of markets, finance, and technologies in a way that is shrinking the world from a size medium to a size small, and enabling each of us to reach around the world farther, faster, and cheaper than ever before. So I'm just pulling in different definitions from different scholars. They are all saying a lot of the same things, just in slightly different ways. So I want to kind of give you different kind of perspectives. I like that, from a size medium to a size small. And farther, faster, and cheaper than ever before, right? So reaching around across the world, right? So again, through communication technologies, travel technologies, we can go further, we can get there faster, and it's all cheaper than it ever was before. So communication technology cheaper, travel cheaper, getting products from abroad is cheaper, and faster. So think of the ordering products from Amazon, which could be coming from just about anywhere. You could now get same day or 1 day shipping, which is amazing. And it's not just other e-commerce providers too. So globalization includes expanded international trade, expanded telecommunications, monetary coordination, multinational corporations, technical and scientific cooperation, cultural exchanges of new types and scales, migration and refugee flows, and relations between the world's rich and poor countries. So all these things kind of play into dynamics that are happening within globalization. So they're all different things that we need to be paying attention to when we're looking at globalization. Today, we're going to be focusing more on kind of the trade side, international trade. But all of these different things are things that are being affected through the spread of globalization. And so all of them are definitely things that you'll want to be paying attention to as you kind of watch the world. So how do our three different theories look at globalization? So our liberal, critical, mercantilist, and critical approaches, how do they all kind of view globalization? So the liberal view is integrating in world economy brings growth and prosperity, right? So similar to what we said, kind of just on the trade side, as you open up the world economy and take down barriers and let businesses, do business with businesses, and individuals do business with other individuals, and there's, no blockading, you get greater global efficiency, you get greater global growth, and so you see gains for countries around the world, and people are more prosperous in general. States are losing importance to intergovernmental organizations, multinational corporations, and non-governmental organizations. So there's an element of this that people have talked about, the demise of states, that particularly multinational corporations are gaining in prominence. And I did show you on that first day kind of the comparing of I believe it was 100 largest economic entities in the world, and 73 or something like that of them were corporations, and only about 27 of them were states. So it's certainly shown that many multinational corporations, in terms of pure financial power, actually you know, are larger than many states. That said, we also don't want to overstate, right? Like the death of the state. States are still incredibly important, are still, uh, it's hard to uh, look at the world today and still and say that states aren't of critical importance in setting policy. Just look at, something like COVID-19, and yes, it's showing the importance of globalization in terms of how quickly that spread. But also, if you're looking at the importance of states, it was states who largely, with the help of ITOs and NGOs, like IGOs, like the World Health Organization, and multinational corporations in providing supplies, but it was states and local governments that are leading the effort. And so if you want to look at how the spread of the virus has operated in different countries, you also look at the policies within those countries, and you could certainly see that, well, the pandemic could get everywhere. How quickly or how much it spread to a certain extent was dependent on the actions of the government and how they managed it. So certainly, states are losing importance to these different actors, but it's not to say that they're gone. The North-South division, so between what we call the global North and the global South, and typically your richer and poorer countries, is less important since the global South is moving in divergent directions depending on countries and regions' integration um, with world markets. So those global South countries that have integrated into the world market are doing quite well. So you're seeing, some countries are still getting stuck behind, but those that have really integrated into the world economy are actually doing quite well. So it's harder to talk about a kind of uniform global North and a uniform global South, particularly within the global South. You've seen, some real success stories from the liberal perspective, and you've seen certainly countries that have been a lot less successful. The critical theorist view. Globalization is a process with long historical origins, not a recent phenomenon, as economic liberals regularly suggest. And so there is a lot of truth to that while globalization may have accelerated and may be more apparent, that's not to say that we haven't had, increasing, kind of deeper, wider, and faster economic and cultural and technological exchange over centuries. It's so apparent now because of how fast things are, right? But if you think of from shipping, just even being able to sell across oceans, that was massive. So it's throughout human history that we've kind of been progressing towards a more globalized world, and it's not that recent a phenomenon. It may just have it is possible that it's not a linear process, and it at certain points can accelerate or have a deeper impact. But we do want to look at it within kind of a more of a historical context from the critical theorist perspective. Economic inequality is increasing, including if we look at the North versus the South, but also within states, right? And you could see that within many states, even in the global North, that if you look within the states, they take the United States, there's very, very pronounced increases in economic inequality. So the rich continue getting a lot more, and the poorest are staying relatively stagnant. And that's definitely true in many northern global North countries, even many of the richest, where you've seen relatively stagnating wages that barely keep pace with inflation in the global North. And if that means that if the entire economy is getting larger and middle class and lower classes aren't getting more, that means all of this increased wealth is typically going to your richest. And that's definitely true globally. Not So we're seeing increase between countries, particularly your richer and your haves and your have-nots. You're getting a larger spread between your haves and have-nots between countries, but also within countries, you're getting an increase inequality between your haves and your have-nots. If you look at the purchasing power of the middle class in, say, North America, it's much lower than it was decades ago. So continuing on globalization, critical theorist view on globalization, that it's, when we talk about globalization or globalized civilization, it's really civilization based on norms associated with the West, right? So rather than globalization, it may be more appropriate to talk about westernization, because based on norms associated with the West and spread of neoliberal market ideology around the world. This increasing homogeneity is in part offset by small local moments of resistance in which people try to identify along the lines of language, religion, and other cultural factors. Right. So when we talk about globalization, in many ways, it's true that if we look at the spread of the norms, if we spread like an economic system, even many cultural products, right? It's spreading of Western products, Western economic systems, Western values, Western film, television, cultural products around the world. And that's not to say that the rest of the world doesn't send any of those things in or doesn't contribute at all. But when we're talking about the homogenizing of the world, as everyone's kind of gaining access to the same type of input or the same forces, those forces are disproportionately coming from the West. And that can provoke, so if when we're looking at resistance in different parts of the world, that's one important thing to keep in mind, is that many of these resistance are pushbacks partially against globalization, but more about its westernization, right? About wanting to keep local norms based on or local language, right? Because English is increasingly the global language, wanting to keep religious values and other cultural factors, not wanting to just be consuming Western values, products, language, religion, and culture. Okay, the mercantilist view on globalization. Mercantilists focus on the erosion of state sovereignty and diffusion of authority to more actors, including many non-state actors. So remember, if economics is supposed to serve the state and the state power, and if globalization is moving power away from the state, this is something that mercantilists are certainly going to be focusing on. Whether or not state power is strengthened or weakened by globalization remains to be seen. It may be that state power will be transformed to operate in new contexts with new tools. So it, also people say the death of the state. Let's see how the state responds. However, the concern from this perspective is that states will be eclipsed by new and more powerful global actors, either, some supranational type bodies in the IGO, so kind of trying to go world government a la UN, but more likely regional type ones of EU style, which from a just purely state power perspective involves giving up of some state power to a supranational body. So certain, for example, regulations or policies in the EU are set EU-wide, not country-wide, and domestic governments are forced to implement those policies, but also kind of the loss of power to other actors like multinational corporations. And this would certainly be a concern from a mercantilist perspective. All right, let's look a little bit deeper at trade. Now that we've kind of talked a little bit about globalization and our different theories, let's dive a little bit deeper into trade itself. So about 1/6 of total economic activity in the world is trade. So that's quite a lot of economic activity. It accounts for about 19 trillion worth of trade each year. So that's a massive sum, many times the size of the Canadian economy. And it's 12 times larger than the global military spending. So when we talk so much about military spending and military security and defense and all that stuff, if we're talking about in terms of spending and economic activity, trade is actually a much larger force in terms of its at least magnitude of spending. Here's world merchandise and trade and commercial services from 2005 to 2015, pulled from the World Trade Organization. And so you could see that trade. So we did have the blip of this should be around 2008, 2009, where we saw, the collapse in the world economy with the world financial crisis. So we see the blip around here, but generally we see trade. So the magnitudes, and it tends to be going up. And same thing in trade and services, much lower than trade in goods. And there is some variation always, like we see a small downturn here, but in general, we see a trend upwards in terms of both, and very, very high volumes. Economies by size of merchandise trade in 2015. So billions of US dollars. So the darker the color, the larger the magnitude of trade in terms of billions of dollars. So we see kind of the US, China, Japan, some of the Western European countries, the UK, France, Germany, leading the world in terms of at least volumes of, or at least volumes in terms of currency. So, and then you've got kind of your second tier of Canada, Mexico, Russia, many of the other Western European countries, and then India. And then going further down, depending, Brazil, Australia, not many actually in that category. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, in that category. So you could notice most of the largest economies are in what we'd call the global north, and the lowest amounts of trade are definitely in these regions. Um, 52%. So merchandise trade, merchandise exports of WTO members totaled 16.2 trillion in 2015. 52%. The top 10 merchandise traders accounted for 52% of the world's total trade in 2015. So half of world trade was kind of conducted by only 10 countries. So out of 190, say, countries, 10 of them accounted for half of it. And developing economies had only 42% share in world merchandise trade in 2015. And given that developing economies account for a massive share of the world population, so it still is showing that, some level of inequality. Trade is certainly more prevalent and probably helping your richer countries more. That's not to say that trade isn't important in less developed countries. This is showing total volume, right? But it also makes sense that larger economies will have more trade, and smaller economies will have less trade, because larger economies can produce more and can also buy more. So that makes some sense. So I don't want those slides to make you think that trade is unimportant in less developed countries. The level of development isn't necessarily correlated with how important trade is. So volumes of trade are larger in industrialized countries. Trade plays as important of a role in less developed countries. We'll take a look here. So world development, so this is from World Development Indicators from, I think from World Bank. I got this. This is trade as a percentage of GDP. And so the lighter you get, the more important trade is as a percentage of your GDP. So the darkest is from 22 to 48% of your GDP, and then it keeps going up. So trade is percentage of your GDP. And you can see, say, countries like the US and China, which are your two largest traders in terms of volume, are in the lowest category for what it makes up of in terms of their economies, because they have such massively large internal economies that, yes, they do a massive amounts of trade, but they also do a massive, the US has got 300 something million, more than 1 billion in China. So they have massive internal markets. So yes, they do huge volumes of international trade, but also huge volumes of internal trade. whereas many other countries. So if we take, Canada, Canada's got a much smaller internal market, only 36 million people. So trade plays a much larger or more important role in the Canadian economy, particularly trade in our case with the US. We see that in much of Western Europe, or much of Europe in general. There's very few that are in the kind of your darkest category. And if you look kind of globally, whereas, this map, you could see very clear kind of geographic in terms of volume, north-south, and you could definitely see certain regions, for example, had higher volumes than other regions. Here, you don't see nearly as much of a regional pattern. Particularly look at a continent like Africa. So some you don't have data, but you go from all the way to the lowest category to the highest category, and pretty much everything in between. Europe too, you go from the lowest to the highest category, and pretty much everything in between. So development doesn't necessarily, high development or low development doesn't necessarily mean that trade is more or less important to you based on the size of your economy. Let's look at some trade trends. So what trends can we see when we look at patterns in trade? So certainly global integration. And so that kind of fits with our globalization we talked about with globalization. We see integration of industrialized regions with each other in a truly global market. The World Trade Organization is especially important. So World Trade Organization members and how much they trade with each other. And we have seen massive increases in trade globally across the world, falling in trade barriers through different WTO negotiations. So now trade barriers keep coming down. And so it's easier to trade with almost any country in the world. So we're definitely seeing global integration, that if you go into the store and you look at where is a product from, it could be from almost anywhere, from almost any region, depending on kind of the volume of trade. Some regions are going to be or some countries are going to be more likely to find, but we really see a global integration. But at the same time, we see a global integration, we also see a regional integration. So emerging potential division of the industrialized West into three competing trading blocks, each internally integrated, but not very open to the other two blocks. Regional free trade areas in Europe and North America, and perhaps in Asia in the future, raise the possibility of trading zones practicing liberalism inwardly and mercantilism outwardly. So at the same time that we're seeing kind of a globalization in falling of kind of global barriers to trade, we're also seeing patterns of regional integration, where within a region, barriers are almost completely eliminated, or eliminated even more, and they're putting up a common barrier against external states, at least in the European case. But at least in all of the trade blocks, you see more or larger falling barriers within regions. So particularly within Europe and North America, but you're seeing some elements of it in Asia as well. And then you see some other regional ones of like Asia Pacific, which may include Canada or the US, or Australia, or Pacific countries in South America, into different regions. And they have decreased barriers. But this kind of competing, every time you've got regional integration, unless that could expand into global integration, you see a tension of, are we going to go where just barriers globally fall, or are we going to go into competing blocks? Europe competes with, it's got like almost like super Europe economy competing against super North America economy competing against super Asia economy, where they've got low barriers inwardly. So particularly within Europe, no boundaries inwardly. So trade is completely free. We're open within European Union, but will the European Union start putting up tougher and tougher barriers to people who are outside of the EU? And you see some element of looking like with these formation of blocks that could happen. So why does trade work? Why does trade help make people better, or better off? help increase global gains. So gains from trade are possible due to the comparative advantage states enjoy in producing certain goods. So not every state is as good at producing everything. So there's some things that, for example, Canada is really good at producing, and some things Canada is really not good at producing. Some things Canada can't produce. And so the idea of comparative advantage would be, so if we take the things Canada's, if you don't have free trade and you take the things Canada's not good at producing, right? Canadians, if they're having to buy it produced by domestic producers, they're going to be paying really high costs because Canada's not good at producing it, or will be buying really low quality because Canada's not good at producing it. But if you're able to bring in products from outside, from countries that can produce it much better, much higher quality, cheaper cost, then Canadians do better because they get better products, lower cost. And then if Canada exports the areas where Canada has an advantage, produces really well, then Canada makes a lot of money off of selling it because we've got an advantage. Other people want our product, but also those who buy it, right? They do better off. They're not wasting as much money on buying the product locally. They're saving a bunch of money by buying it internationally. So how do we figure out who's got comparative advantage in what areas? We look at the factors of production for that, and factors of production are basic inputs to production. And we tend to look at it in terms of land, labor, and capital. So land being the territory and kind of the resources on it that you need. Labor is your workers, and capital is the money or the tech or factories that are needed to produce something. And each different good that you sell requires certain different inputs, right? Some take a lot of labor to produce, but don't take much capital and don't take much land. Some, something like, say, farming takes a lot of land, or a lot of natural resource type things require a lot of land. If you want to be doing timber, well, you need to have really big forests to get the timber from. If you want to do mining, well, you need a whole bunch of different mines, and that requires land with different resources in it. And so each country is going to have, so each good requires different factors of production. And each country has relative abundance of each factor, and they differ in this relative abundance. So some will do really well in one factor and really poorly in another factor. So some countries like Canada and Russia have large territories and natural resources. So if we look at a comparative advantage in terms of any good that requires a lot of land, well, Canada and Russia are doing really well there. But Canada, certainly, and also to a certain extent Russia, goods that require a lot of labor. Canada certainly, 36 million is not a small country if we compare it to countries around the world. It's also not a big country. And so in terms of labor, Canada doesn't have a relative abundance. We have a relative shortage of labor. So other countries such as China and India have large populations, right? So relative to others, they have a cheap supply of labor compared to others, where Canada, compared to other countries, has a cheap supply or relative abundance of land. So each nation's comparative advantage is traced to its particular endowments, so how much it has of different factors of production, that is basic inputs such as land, labor, and capital that are used in different proportions in the production of different goods and services. Since the cost of these inputs in each country will depend on the availability, difference in factors of endowments across countries will create differences in comparative advantage. Each country will tend to export items whose production requires intensive use of the factors with which it is abundantly endowed relative to other nations, right? So the cost of different inputs depends on its availability. So if you've got a lot of a particular resource, then it's not very expensive to use. So for example, using land in Canada, well, because there's an abundance of land, getting land isn't particularly expensive. Think of a much smaller country that has very little land and say a large population on that land. Getting land is extremely costly. So if you want to be producing a good that takes land, acquiring that land is very, very costly in some countries, in a country like Canada, it's very, very cheap. Same thing for something like labor. In a country like Canada with a relatively low population, getting the best talent can be very, very costly because there's not a huge amount of workers. Or if you need a lot of workers, because you're competing with different industries for a relatively small population, then it could be quite costly. Where if you're dealing with a massive country with a huge population, it's less costly to be able to get the different wage earners that you need, or the different laborers that you need. And so countries will export or tend to produce the goods where they have an advantage. So you'd say, for example, Canada should tend to produce goods that require a lot of land, so a lot of resource type based things or agricultural based things. Because we've got a lot of land, we can produce those goods cheaper than a country that has really expensive land. And so we can earn a lot of money. We can produce it cheaply and then sell it at a lower price than international competitors. People in other countries will want to buy it. And so we can make a lot of money because other people globally, we're not just selling our agricultural product anymore to Canadians, you're selling it to people, around the world. We're selling the natural resources to people around the world, and those people want to buy it because we can produce it cheaper than they can. Similar logic again, going back to land, is that, going back to labor, is, a lot of labor-intensive products we buy from more populous countries because they can produce the products cheaper than we can. If you look at the wages it would take to pay people to produce it in Canada, it's much higher. And part of that is tied to the size of the population or the abundance of the factor. Balance of trade. So when we look at trade and patterns of trade across countries, we look at the balance of trade, which is the values of a state's exports relative to its imports. So you take the exports and subtract the imports and find the balance of trade. If you have a positive balance of trade, that's a country that exports more than it imports. So it has a trade surplus. It makes more money from trade. So it sells a lot and gets back a lot of money. It only spends some of that money on imports. So at the end of the day, it comes out richer from trade. Negative balance of trade, a country that imports more than it exports. Now, there's a lot of discussion in politics about, which is better. Many countries, particularly in the Donald Trump presidency, talks about how the U.S. loses in trade. It's a lot more complicated than we just want trade surpluses, want to avoid trade deficits. Yes, trade deficits have certain costs, right? But exporting is great because it brings in money to you. Importing is also great from kind of a comparative advantage perspective because importing means that you're getting products cheaper than you could have at home, right? If you're not if you put limits on importing, or if you say, hey, importing is terrible, well, then you're buying often, more expensive local products. So from a consumer's perspective, importing is actually really good because then we get a better selection of products. We can choose, from a larger selection and find one that we really like, and the price will be lower. But at the end of the day, you also have to pay some attention to the balance of trade, because if you have a negative balance of trade, you're paying for that trade deficit in some way. So the balance of trade must ultimately be reconciled, right? So if you have a surplus or if you have a deficit, right, you have to some way or other get back to zero, because you can't have more money flowing into your country. Somehow, for example, if you've got excess, if you have a trade surplus, right, and you've got extra money from another country's currency, well, you've got to somehow spend that in some way. So it's tracked financially through a system of national accounts. In the short term, a state can trade for a few years at a deficit, followed by a few years at a surplus. Sometimes it is quite a long period at a deficit. The imbalances are carried on the national accounts as a kind of loan, right? So other countries are kind of just holding your currency, and we're willing to accept just holding excess currency. However, a trade deficit that persists for years becomes a problem because people are going to want to be spending this surplus money. This is an oversimplification, but a state with a chronic trade deficit must export part of its standing wealth, real estate companies, bank accounts, etc., by giving ownership of such wealth to foreigners. So what are people going to do if they've got an excess of your currency from trade surpluses? Well, what are they often going to do is they're going to buy wealth in your country. So if I've got excess US dollars, what am I going to do from trade? Well, I might buy something in the US with those US dollars. So, and this might be real estate companies, bank accounts, or whatever, but you're giving some of your nation's wealth to someone else. Interdependence is a concept that we've talked about before, but it's certainly important as it relates to trade. So interdependence, again, is a political or economic situation in which two or more states are simultaneously dependent on one another for their well-being. Degrees of interdependence are sometimes designated as sensitivity or vulnerability. Remember that if you think about interdependence, free trade certainly creates a system where countries are interdependent on each other. If we move into a global market where you're producing the goods where you have a comparative advantage and importing the goods where you have a comparative disadvantage, right? You're relying on those other countries, A, to continue buying your goods, because if they stop buying it, you're going to be producing way too much of that good where you have a comparative advantage, but also you're just not producing a whole bunch of things that you need because you because you were able to buy it. And so if you get disruptions to global trade, you can then have massive disruptions to global supply chain of things you need. So for example, say you're buying medications from another country. So this is a salient one for right now. Say you're buying a whole bunch of medical equipment or medications from another country. And because of some crisis, like a pandemic, countries either are unable to produce those goods because of illness or are unwilling to export it because of fear that they're going to have a shortage, then that's disrupted. You can't overnight start up a new supply of medical equipment or a new supply of drugs. It takes some time to implement. And so you could be facing a shortage. And so there is always something, interdependence has, some goods, but it also introduces certain risks. So sensitivity is the short-term dislocation caused by disrupting exchanges with another country. It's a sensitivity of supply. Over the long term, states may be able to change their policies to take advantage of alternatives that could substitute for disrupted trade. And vulnerability is a state that cannot adjust its policies to cope with disrupted trade, even over the long run, suffers from vulnerability of the supply. Right. So you're sensitive to trade if there's a disruption in trade, but over time you're able to, and so you may have a short-term disruption in your supply chain. So but over time you'd be able to find alternatives. So take again medication, right? In the short term, if the countries that produce medicines that we import, if they stopped selling to Canada, we'd have a short-term disruption in our supply chain, and that could be very problematic in itself, right? But over time, Canada would have the know-how to set up and produce all of these different medications. And so we could, over the long term, find alternatives either with a different trading partner or just with our own domestic industry and replace those medical equipment or those medications. And so we're sensitive to disruptions in that type of trade, but it's something that we can adapt to. Vulnerability is when not only are you sensitive to short-term disruptions, but you're unable to adapt. And that means you're vulnerable to a change. So for example, it might be that you'd be vulnerable if to certain resources, right? If there's no substitute for a particular resource and you don't have any of that resource and the people who have it stop selling it to you, then you're vulnerable to that disruption because you don't have. And many have talked about oil as one of those. While we're working on alternative technologies and green technologies and all different replacement for oil, oil still plays a key part in so much of our economy. And so if you're a country that has no oil or doesn't produce oil or doesn't produce nearly enough of it, and even in the medium to long term, you could be working on alternatives, but if it's going to take a really, really, really long time, then you're vulnerable to disruptions in that supply. Trade states become mutually dependent on each other's political cooperation in order to gain relative economic gains. In international political economy, interdependence refers less to a bilateral mutual dependence than to a multilateral dependence, in which each state depends on the political cooperation of most or all of the others to keep world markets operating efficiently. Most states depend on the world market and not on specific trading partners. So often when we're talking security, we're talking kind of like two states or a few states may be dependent on each other. In trade, we're really talking about a global market for most states, right? There's very few products that are only controlled by one state. So usually, even if one state would cut its ties with you, you weren't just dependent on them. You could get supply from someone else, or you could get that supply through someone else, even if they, bought it from state A that kind of cut off ties with you. So it's really more you're looking at kind of all different countries. You're interdependent on all, or at least most countries, continuing to participate in this system and making sure that the supply chains stay open, that there's no disruptions to the ability to get products to where they're going, that everybody's cooperating in the maintenance of the system. Most states depend more on the world market and not a specific trading partner. Now there are certain, counterexamples where it's taking Canada, for example. Canada is obviously dependent on the world market, and we sell to many, many different countries, and we also import from many countries. Again, if you go into a store and you look at the labels of where things are produced, they're produced in so many different places. But also, though, if you look at Canada's kind of like trade statistics, a vast majority of our trade is with the United States. So to a certain extent, we're, yes, interdependent on or dependent on a global system of trade. But we're also really dependent on the United States because, yes, over probably the long term, if the US decide we're not going to trade with Canada, we could probably replace all of our exports over time and all of our imports and get them from somewhere else. It would take quite a lot of time because it takes so long just because we'd be replacing probably like 80% of our trade. So we need to find, buyers for not just some of our exports, for the vast majority of our exports. We'd have to be finding imports, not just for some of our imports, but for most of our imports. So there certainly are certain situations where states still are dependent on a specific trading partner as well. So what are different strategies you can use for trading? So given that we see, trade is a fact of the world, states need different strategies for trying to manage how are they going to approach it. So the one that you see the least frequently is called autarky, which really means self-reliance. And it's a policy of avoiding or minimizing trade and trying to produce everything one needs, the most vital things by oneself. Pretty much nobody does it. Even North Korea has trade with, say, China to a certain extent. So this isn't really a strategy that anyone's adopting. Some want to, minimize trade to a certain extent, or produce as much as they can at home, but nobody goes kind of the full autarky route of being self-reliant. Trade definitely has won out as a kind of global norm in the sense that even if not everybody likes it, not everybody participates in the same way, even if there's different strategies and some cheat and, there's debates about how good trade is, everybody at least participates to a certain extent in the international kind of in international trade. Second is protectionism. And even in free trade systems, everybody to a certain extent, even all those countries that say we're big in free trade and we want open markets, every country in the world to a certain extent exhibits some levels of protectionism. And in particular, in some of the cases we're going to talk about. So the protection of domestic industries against international competition by trade, tariffs, or other means, right? So every time that you're trying to protect your industries against different uh, importers, you're engaging in protectionism. So a lot of countries will say, you know, we really, really like international trade and we don't want any barriers on our export. Oh, but we need to protect this domestic industry. So they don't want anybody else putting up barriers, but they want to put up barriers of their own. And so this is really, really common to protect some domestic industries. And at certain times, it's actually, you know, even if you're a supporter of free trade, can be justified. So what are motivations? When do you see this most frequently? Versus protection of infant industries. So if your country is developing a new industry, so say you're just starting out and developing a new airline industry or a new technology or new manufacturing in a certain industry, at the beginning when you're developing a new industry in your country, you're not going to be competitive with people who have been doing it for a really long time. So the idea of protectionism is to, you know, give your infant industry, you know, a little bit of time where they're protected from competition while they're not competitive. To do this smart though, you can't protect them so much that they don't develop, right? If you protect them so much and they feel like they're going to get protected forever, they may never become competitive. And so it may either have to be something that you protect them forever, or that once you take off the protection, they end up failing. And so what was the point? So if this is to be done and done smartly, it should be done in a way that you're pushing still the company or the industry toward being competitive. Breathing room when market conditions shift or new competition emerges. Sometimes just something in the market changes, a massive new player emerges, or there's some disruption in the market, and you know the local industries in your country, they just need a little bit of time to recuperate, to adjust to the new economic reality. So protectionism may be put in to just to give them a little bit of time to emerge or to kind of adjust. Protect national security. So there's some industries that, for example, are related to production of weaponry, or that are important in production of weaponry, that states like to protect because they don't want to rely on other countries, particularly great powers don't want to rely on other countries for their national security hardware, so for their key weapon systems and stuff like that. And so they want to make sure that they've got the, within their own country, they have strong industries that can produce those technologies or can produce those materials, so the raw materials or the technologies used to assemble them. So they might want to protect and have a domestic aerospace industry. They might want to have you know, a domestic steel industry, and they want to protect these from competition because they don't want them to collapse, because they need them for producing things that are of key importance. And they're worried that if you say, you know, even if you've got all the technology for war, but you need steel to build it and you don't have a domestic steel industry, if the people who do have domestic steel industries end up sometime in the future becoming an enemy, then they can choke you off from what you need to protect your weapon or produce your weaponry. Protected cultural diversity. So this is very common, and this is actually one that most people would admit to there being some justification for, is protected cultural diversity. So think of, you know, in Canada, on the radio and on television, Canadian networks or stations have Canada content rules, and that's to make sure that, you know, our television isn't just showing American TV. For example, you know, American television shows can, because of the nature of their market, you know, a larger market with more money, they can produce, you know, I don't want to say higher quality, but often they, for example, particularly in English language TV, American TV productions have much larger budgets than Canadian TV budgets. This is less true in the French-Canadian cultural market for reasons that we don't really need to get into. And so, you know, if budget doesn't correlate perfectly with quality, but there are certain budget present certain advantages. So if you told Canadians, you know, do you want to watch these high budget American TV shows or movies, or do you want to watch these low budget Canadian ones? Most people, or a lot of people, too many people, from the perspective of the survival of the Canadian industry, would choose just the American ones. So if we believe that, we shouldn't just be watching American productions, that not only because we want to be supporting Canadian, workers, but also because Canadian productions also include elements of Canadian culture, and we don't want to just be getting culture from the United States. Nothing against American culture, but it's not exactly ours. And so we want to still have shows that, reflect the Canadian way of life. And the only way to do that is to a certain extent protect the Canadian industry. So in that case, it's not, some is government grants to production, but some of it is Canada content rules, where a certain percentage of time has to go to Canadian content. Now, oftentimes that ends up getting, it's not necessarily that they put in Canadian content of, comedies or dramas. It ends up being Canadian content of news programming and sports. But at least it's something to guarantee that there's some level of Canada. And defensive efforts to ward off predatory practices by foreign companies or states. So again, this is another one that I think a lot of people would support as being justifiable. The last two probably being the ones that would most widely be viewed as justifiable. And this last one is essentially saying, if a company or another country, but a company outside of your country or just another country in general is cheating, well, the only reason that their firm might be products might be being your firm products is because that other company from the other state is getting an unfair advantage. And so, the government may put in protectionism or help its state or limit the availability of other products that come into its country to kind of compensate for the fact that it's cheating. Now, unfortunately, sometimes this becomes that you end up getting long debates in court cases over what constitutes cheating. And there's even a little bit of cheating into accusations of cheating sometimes. But if you do see a state, and this is something that's built into the WTO, if another state is found to be cheating, to be giving unfair advantages to its companies, those who brought the charge against it are allowed to put in kind of countervailing measures. So either to impose punitive strategies against that other company, or to in somehow way help its own company. Methods. So how do you go about protectionism? So a tariff is one of the common ones. So that's a duty or tax levied on certain types of imports, usually as a percentage of their value, same for country. So if you've ever bought something from abroad and you see that there's this extra tax or the duty, or you went shopping in the United States and when you're crossing, they asked how much did you spend, and if it's above a certain amount, they put on this tax plus a tariff. And so this is a way of trying to make shopping in another country more expensive. It's an additional tax. So even if, say, they buying the good, so forget about exchange rates, even if buying the good in the other country was the same price or cheaper than buying it in Canada, by adding this extra tax, it may make it more expensive. And so people might be less likely to do it. Non-tariff barriers. So these are forms of restricting imports other than tariffs. So they're barriers to trade that don't involve taxing. And they might include things like quotas. So you're only allowed, say, bringing in X number of iPhones into Canada. And so any more than that, you'd have to buy from a Canadian cell phone producer, Blackberries, say. So ceiling on how many goods of a certain kind can be imported. So anytime you've got a quota, that's not technically a tax, but it still is a limitation. Your company, domestic company, may lose out on the first X number until that quota is reached, but then after that, people can't buy that product. Subsidies. So that's when the government gives money to the domestic industry. So rather than making the other one more expensive, it helps to make the domestic export or the domestic product cheaper by putting in money to help in the development. And then restrictions and regulations. So this is one that's very hotly debated are restrictions and regulations, because they can be used as trade barriers, but sometimes they're clearly put there. Japan at times has been particularly notorious on putting on safety regulations that make no sense and just are absolutely clearly meant as trade barriers. But then there's other times where a country says that it should have the right to set sort of environmental or health or safety standards on products that will be consumed by its people, right? So, for example, if you want to sell a car in Canada and Canada cares about environmental standards, or if Canada cares about environmental standards, then it may say that the car needs a certain, fuel efficiency, right? It can't be too polluting of a car. And oftentimes that will be, that's probably often in that particular case not meant as a barrier to trade. The goal isn't to restrict trade. It's something that's been put on producers from wherever it comes, including domestic producers. And the goal of the regulation is helping environment. So it's fitting with the goal of the government. And so that's not really a trade barrier. That it can be a barrier to trade, but it's not what it's not protectionism. It's not intended in that sense. Where you sometimes end up getting into debates is so that governments can use that. For example, say Canada, again, looking at, say, the environmental standard, knew that only Canadian car companies could afford, or North American, because it's so integrated, only North American car companies could afford to meet these standards. Other producers couldn't afford to meet these standards, either because it would involve costly research or making two different variants, one at a higher, or they just don't have the technology, whatever it might be. If you know that, if the reason you're putting the restriction is because you say it's in the name of the environment, but it's really so that you know that only your companies can meet those regulations, then that's not because you necessarily care about the environment or health standards or safety. That's because you're trying to protect your industries. You're trying to make it so that other companies can't trade. And that then would become a trade barrier. And that would be something that the WTO would look at and say, no, that's problematic. But where this one in particular, the restrictions and regulations can become difficult is, especially when you're dealing with things like environmental or health or stuff like that standards, it can be very hard to figure out which ones are genuine, we care about this health or safety or environmental standard, and which ones are, oh, well, this is actually just put there in terms of being a really effective trade barrier. Debates over trade. So we've kind of talked quite a bit already about, that some people like trade and some people don't. And the heart of the debates over trade come from, while there's gains from trade for all countries in the aggregate. So everybody does better in general from trade. And so the size of the pie does increase. What makes trade so controversial is that among individuals within each country, trade creates winners and losers. So some people gain more than others. And not only do some people gain more than others, some people actually do lose, right? Like when you go to comparative advantage, when you go to free trade, some industries are going to lose, some workers are going to lose their job, some companies are going to fold, some are going to do fantastic because they're able to export so much more. But those particularly that are competing with imports, are sometimes going to struggle. And so people who are associated with those could lose their job, could lose, or at least, get decreases in wages. Some people could get laid off. Companies will make less. So there's different models that have been produced that look at preferences on trade and can we figure out who's going to be a supporter of free trade and who's not going to be a supporter of free trade. And there's a couple of models I want to look at. So the Stolper-Samuelson theorem looks at factor production as influencing preferences on trade. And it argues that by encouraging specialization in each economy in export-oriented types of production, trade increases the demand for locally abundant factors while reducing demand for locally scarce factors. So according to this, So according to the Stoper-Samuelson theorem, right, because trade becomes organized around factors of production based on comparative advantage. So Canada would specialize or would do really well export type industries that rely on its abundant factors of production and would start specializing it. So in Canada's case, land, say, but so that would mean that people who own land or who are associated with industries involved with land, so the owners of land would do really well. Say the people owners of other factors, particularly say in the Canada's case, the non-abundant factors, so say labor, we're all of a sudden going to be competing with industries. So laborers in Canada are all of a sudden going to be competing with laborers in countries where labor is a much more abundant factor, and so it's much cheaper. So owners of land in Canada from free trade, right, because that's going to be, there'll be a specialization, they're going to do really well in exporting. People who own that factor, right, so landowners are going to love free trade. People who own, say, labor, and by labor I mean own labor, so workers, they're gonna they're probably, because they're going to lose out in Canada. This will be different in different countries depending. So laborers may not like it as much. Now, if you're a laborer in a country where that's an abundant factor of production, all of a sudden there's more demand for your work. There may be more earnings that could be coming in. So you may like free trade if you're a country, say, that a very tiny country. So if you're a farmer in a tiny country where land is really expensive, and so where say agricultural products are more expensive to create, then you're probably not going to like free trade. So it depends on what factor. Are you a landowner? Are you a owner of labor, so a worker, or are you owner of capital, so of wealth to invest, or owner of a factory? How much you like trade is going to depend on kind of the relative abundance of these different factors in your country, and which ones are you going to specialize in? How are you going to do in trade based on the demand for your locally abundant factor? The second model, the specific factors model, focuses not on the factor of production, but on the industry. And the reason being that the real incomes of different individuals are tied very closely to the fortunes of the particular industries in which they make their living. Individuals employed or invested in export industries benefit from trade according to this model, while those who are attached to import competing industries are harmed. And so this kind of looks at that changing industries is really difficult. So it's less that we're going to see, an alliance or preferences coming from, are you a worker, a capital owner, or a landowner? It's going to be looking at how does your industry survive. So if you're in an industry that's a high demand, or that's an exporting industry, right, and does well from exporting, it doesn't matter whether you're the owner of the factory, the owner of the land, or one of the workers in that industry, you're doing well. So even if you're a laborer in Canada, but you're working in an industry that exports really well, even though from the Stoper-Samuelson perspective, as a laborer, you shouldn't like trade, you're actually doing really well. But if you're a laborer or a landowner, say you're a landowner in an industry that's not doing exporting as well, or is competing with other importers. In Canada, it doesn't matter if you're an owner of an abandoned factor in Canada, you're not going to be doing as well, and so you're not going to like trade as much. So it's more kind of alliances across the different factors within industries, depending on, is that industry an exporter or an import competing industry? And it's based on the idea that it's hard to change industry. So for laborers, if you're trained in one industry, it doesn't mean that overnight you could be trained in a new one. So even if you're, in a great exporting country for labor, and labor doing great as a factor of production, if you're in an industry that goes under, it's not like you're going to necessarily be able to get retrained immediately, and it could harm you. Same thing if you're an owner of a factory, right? It's very costly to transform a factory into producing something else. So if your industry goes under, even if you're in a country where owning capital is abundant, and so capital should be able to do well in terms of exporting. If you're in an industry that's import competing or is not exporting particularly well, then it's very costly for you to change, and so you don't want to be competing with other companies who are trying to export into your country. So you don't want to be import competing. And so all of this is based on, it's difficult to change industry. So you get an alliance less based on factors, but on industry type. And how well is that? Is it an exporting industry, in which case you like free trade, or is it an import competing industry, which are harmed by free trade and so won't like free trade as much? All right, so that's the lecture on international trade. Hope you enjoyed it, and take care and stay safe.